Bonjour, mesdames et messieurs. Merci à mon ancien chef, colonel Alexandre Vautravers, pour l'invitation. Comme vous voyez, mon intervention concernant la guerre de 6 jours. Et c'est toujours difficile d'avoir la dernière intervention avant le repas. Mais si vous me permettez aussi, je parle en anglais. There are many misconceptions about the Six-Day War, and I'd like to basically try to cover the political military aspects before, at the end, talking about what transpired in terms of Operation Moked, Operation Focus, the Israeli attack. I'm starting with a quote by the famous French scholar, sociologist, Alexis de Tocqueville: a simple but false idea always have greater weight in the world than a true but complex one. In terms of the history, the historiography concerning the Six-Day War has been oversimplified and has been misconstrued. As many of you know, the Six-Day War was one of the most spectacular and swiftest military victories in history, if not the most. And it's interesting that the word Six-Day War was coined by the Israeli Defense Minister, Moshe Dayan, as a conscious allusion to the 6 days of creation in the book of Genesis. As you know, Israel is actually a very ideological country, just as the United States is a very ideological country. So there are many commonalities between the two. The war was important in many ways. Of course, as you know, Israel basically defeated 3 major Arab states. It's dealt a devastating blow to radical Arab nationalism, which has been epitomized by Jamal Abdel Nasser, who'd taken over power in Egypt in 1952 after overthrowing the conservative, pro-Western, pro-British monarchy of King Farouk. Also in the process humiliated the Soviets politically and militarily because they were backers of Syrian Egypt, and also demonstrated Israeli military prowess, Israeli military superiority, which was very much to the satisfaction of the administration of Lyndon Johnson in Washington. And one of the arguments I make is that there was a large degree of collusion between Israel and Washington in the run-up to and during the war. I have a lot of text, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to talk, and in the end I have a few more slides because I'm trying to pull things together. My main arguments are that the mainstream narrative in the West and the Israeli narrative regarding the Six-Day War are not accurate, they're inconsistent, they're flawed, they're incomplete. The argument that Nasser was preparing to attack Israel and that the survival and security of Israel was at stake is actually false. It does not stand up to close scrutiny. Well, please let me...
He closed Tehran Straits or whatever.
Well, please let me finish my I've done a lot of research on this.
Yeah. Some others did too, right?
Yeah, but you shall wait about his arguments and then maybe...
Because we're listening to Jubin Goodarzi and not you.
So Israel's initiation of the hostilities on the 5th of June 1967 cannot be considered a defensive action. At best, it was partially defensive. And as I said, there was a large degree of collusion in the run-up and during the war between the US and Israel. So I'm trying to provide you with background in this regard. It's important to understand that after the Arab-Israeli War of 1940-49, Israel had never been satisfied with the borders that it had. In fact, the first Prime Minister, David Ben-Gurion, had called the borders to be unbearable. And as early as 1950, the Israeli Defense Forces and the Planning Department had drawn up contingency plans for the creation of more natural, defensible boundaries: the Litani River in Lebanon to the north and the Golan Heights, the Jordan River to the east and to the south, the Suez Canal. So a memorandum prepared by the IDF's planning department called these areas strategic living space, or Merhav Mihya in Hebrew. Also, in the run-up to the war, at this point I'm skipping a bit, but I'm going to come back to it. In May of '67, before the war, a month prior to the war, the IDF Chief of Staff, General Yitzhak Rabin, had devised a plan similar to the German Schlieffen Plan during the First World War to knock out the Egyptians first and then to attack Syria. Looking at it from the American perspective, in the decade after the 1956 Suez crisis, Nasser was increasingly viewed as an ingrate in Washington circles. Although Washington had saved him, the US had saved him from humiliation in the 1956 war, he basically then had pursued an independent path, antagonized the US at every turn. Although the Eisenhower-Kennedy administrations have given Egypt aid, food aid and all that, Nasser had, of course, done things to antagonize it. He recognized communist China. He basically sent troops to help the Republican forces in the Yemeni civil war that had broken out in 1962 against the royalists. He supported the Moroccan revolutionary leader, Mehdi Ben Bakra, against the pro-Western monarchy of King Hassan II, and assumed a hostile stance toward many pro-Western regimes in the region, including those of the Shah of Iran, King Idris of Libya, and also King Hussein of Jordan. So by the mid-60s, there was very little sympathy towards, in the Johnson administration, towards Nasser, and he was considered a Soviet proxy. So just as in Israel, where Egypt was considered to be the only Arab country which could pose an existential threat to Israel, the US was also very, the US administration also viewed an event which would lead to the defeat of Nasser, or better yet, his overthrow in a positive light. By the 1960s, tensions between Israel and the Arabs had increased. One of the key issues was Israel's building, starting in the late 50s, of the national water carrier, a plan basically devised to basically divert 77% of the waters from Lake Tiberias, also known as the Sea of Galilee, and the Jordan River, down to the Negev Desert in southern Israel for irrigation and other purposes. So this, of course, would have been to the detriment of Syria and Jordan. And by '63, as the plan neared completion, the Syrians were pushing Nasser in Egypt to take decisive action, but Nasser and the Egyptians, who'd been basically twice bloodied in the 1948 war and the '56, were very reluctant to take action. After the national water carrier was completed in '64, the Syrians basically responded on their own by trying to divert the water through their own means and all that. And what happened was the Israelis responded in a robust manner by shelling the Syrian site in terms of to prevent water diversion. So this did not deter, this does not stop Damascus. So to maintain pressure on the Israelis, what they did was they also allowed unleash the Palestinian guerrilla under the leadership of Yasser Arafat to use Syria as a base to launch cross-border attacks. So Syria also supported the attacks by Fatah to basically uphold its pan-Arab credentials domestically, and also to basically outbid Nasser as the standard bearer of Arab nationalism and the Palestinian cause. So Israel responded to these raids in a disproportionate manner to punish Fatah and try to, and the Syrians, and also to try to deter them from orchestrating such attacks in the future, but that did not work. We had an escalating spiral of tensions. And so Syria continued, and Syria basically grew closer to the Soviet Union, seeking military and political support. The tensions between Syria and Israel grew even more after 1966, when you had the neo-Ba'ath regime of Salah Jadid, the radical Ba'ath regime of Salah Jadid, take power. So they encouraged Fatah to launch attacks against Israel, but also, more than their predecessor, but they also condemned Nasser for not allowing the Palestinians to use Egyptian soil, especially also the Gaza Strip, which was under Egyptian occupation, for the Palestinians to launch attacks, accusing Nasser of being powerless and a coward. The conditions about 6-7 months before the war were aggravated when there had been a number of raids from Syria, but inexplicably the Israelis basically launched a major attack in the West Bank against the towns of El Samu, Jibma, Kirbit, Karka, and basically there were many casualties. Over 140 homes were destroyed and all that. During this attack, the Egyptians had initially promised the Jordanians air cover, but there was no Egyptian air cover coming. And King Hussein then accused Nasser of cowardice. So Nasser found himself in a very uncomfortable position. So he was condemned by many in the Arab world, and also he was basically, he did not want to enter because he was feared that he'd be defeated by the Israelis. So what you had is an escalating spiral of tensions by early 1967, and what you have finally is in April 3rd, what you have is the Israelis added fuel to the fire by stating their intention they're going to farm parts of areas in the demilitarized zone between Syria and Israel. So 4 days once these activities started, the Syrians, the Yobaf, started shelling the demilitarized zone. Israel responded very swiftly and disproportionately with artillery and tank fire, then sent 70 warplanes into Syrian airspace, where they shot down 6 Syrian planes, and then they proceeded to break the sound barrier over Damascus. So within two occasions within 6 months, Israel had unleashed its forces, and the United Arab Command in Cairo, which was supposed to coordinate defense among the neighboring Arab states, had done nothing. So Nasser felt very much to be in the corner and all that, and he basically felt he was basically put in a position where he felt obliged to respond the next time to salvage his credibility. So within less than 3 weeks after the attacks, the clashes, what happened was the Soviet Foreign Ministry summoned the Israeli ambassador to Moscow and basically informed them that Moscow was in possession of information that the Israelis were planning an attack on Syria, and told them not to do so. And the Soviets subsequently shared this information with the Egyptians once an Egyptian delegation a few days later came to Moscow under the leadership of Anwar Sadat. The accuracy of these Soviet reports has been subject to much controversy and discussion throughout the years. But in terms of what happened in the last 2 days of the 67 war, one can argue that, and there are statements subsequently by Israeli military officials and all that something was afoot, a plan, an attack on Syria was indeed on the cards as far as the Israelis were concerned. So what you have was a situation whereby also you had senior Israeli officials such as Yitzhak Rabin and Prime Minister Levi Eshkol making statements about attacking Syria, punishing the Syrians and all that. So for example, on May 11th, Rabin declared on the Israeli radio that, the quote, "The moment is coming when we will march on Damascus to overthrow the Syrian government." And the next day, the head of military intelligence, General Aaron Yariv, told reporters, quote, "We must make it clear to the Syrians that they cannot continue in this way." And I think the only way to make it clear to the Syrians is by using force. During the press briefing, Yariv basically ridiculed Nasser, and he said something very interesting. Quote, "We are creating such a situation that it is impossible for the Egyptians not to act because the strain on their prestige will be unbearable." One has to keep 2 things in mind at this point in terms of was Nasser really also going to react in terms of the information that Syria was going to be attacked once he moved his forces to the Sinai. Keep in mind, Egypt had sent forces to Yemen since they were tied down. In the spring of 1967, there were 70,000 Egyptian troops fighting in Yemen along the Republican forces against royalists. Egypt had lost 15,000 men in the fighting, and the war was costing Egypt $100 million a year, which at that time for Egypt is a lot. The other thing to keep in mind during this period, looking at things internationally, was Nasser felt besieged and cornered, assaulted in many ways. Remember that Nasser was one of not only a leader of the Arab world, but he was one of the leaders of the Third World and of the non-aligned movement. So he basically believed, that his enemies were closing in on him. Keep in mind that in February of 1966, one of the prominent African leaders and founders of the non-aligned movement, Kwame Nkrumah, in Ghana had been overthrown by pro-Western military coup. We know now there's a CIA and others were behind it. And then a month later, another leader of the non-aligned movement, Ahmed Sukarno of Indonesia, was again overthrown in a pro-Western coup by right-wing military, again with the help of the CIA and others. And then across the Mediterranean, it's important to remember, just a month before the war, this leftist civilian government in Greece was removed by the right-wing Greek colonels. So keep all these, so Nasser felt very much on the defensive in many ways. So you have these taunts and threats, and also the reports that Israel was about to attack Syria. So what happened was, within less than 72 hours after the statements by Rabin and Yarif on May 14th, Nasser decided to move 2 divisions, around 58,000 troops, to the Sinai Peninsula. According to both internal US and Israeli assessments, this was only a demonstrative move. It was not a prelude to action. However, the official statements in the press and all that, both in Israel and the West, depicted Cairo's actions as aggressive. But of course, the rhetoric coming from Cairo was also very aggressive about, destroying Israel, etc., etc. But keep in mind, you're talking about an authoritarian regime, not a democratic regime. Authoritarian regimes, as they say, talk is cheap, but deeds are precious. In spite of this move, the neo-Ba'ath said Syria is not, Egypt is not doing enough. It's hiding behind the United Nations Emergency Force in the Sinai, which had been deployed there after the 1956 crisis. So what happened was then Nasser asked for the withdrawal of the United Nations Emergency Force, but he was hoping by escalating at some point the UN, the US, the Soviets would step in to defuse the crisis, and he would be able to save face. But as we'll see, this was not the case. Once UNIF was withdrawn, he was still under immense pressure to basically reinstate the pre-1956 blockade of the Straits of Tiran, which gave Israel access to the Red Sea and the high seas and all that. And of course, this was in direct contravention, violation of the 1957 agreement that had led to the Israeli withdrawal from the Sinai. So he announced on May 22nd that he was closing the Straits, thereby basically giving Israel a casus belli. Basically, this was, by closing this was as an act of war. So he was aware of the risk that he was running, but he thought that international mediation, UN mediation, great power, would basically help resolve the crisis. So in essence, as Abba Eban said, the Israeli foreign minister, Nasser does not want war, but he wants a victory without war, quote unquote. But at this point, finally, Israel and the US did not want a repetition of 56. It was not Eisenhower, things had changed. So the US, of course, the die had been cast. Johnson dispatched the 6th Fleet. 56 vessels were sent, including the aircraft carriers USS America, USS Saratoga, were sent to the Eastern Mediterranean. And in terms of the visits by Abba Eban to Washington and the head of Mossad, they said, we are not going to do anything, but if you do something, we're not going to stand in your way. By late May, American estimates basically concluded that Egypt and the Arabs could be basically defeated within a week. In fact, on May 26, a CIA report landed on Johnson's desk saying that, prophetically, that the war would be over in 6 days. So confidence was so high in the assessments that no contingency plans were made or drawn up in case of a protracted war or in case of an Israeli defeat. Johnson, of course, in the run-up to that, made sure that Israel was well supplied in terms of spare parts, armored personnel carriers, Hawk missiles, tanks, bombs, and all that. And all the shipments were delivered before June 5th. In the Q&A, I'm going over my time, I'm sorry, I'll try to wrap up quickly. I can talk about other things in terms of other collusion that I included in my presentation. So there's no doubt that Nasser set himself up for a situation, but he miscalculated. He basically wanted to pretend he was going to war and all that, and making very aggressive statements and all that, but those are primarily for Egyptian and Arab consumption. But this, of course, was much to the satisfaction of the Israelis and the US, because they provided Israel with a pretext to launch a quote-unquote preemptive strike, and argued that Israel's existence was in danger and that Egypt and its allies were preparing for war. And as you know then, on June 5th, of course, you have the launching of Operation Moked, Operation Focus. So at 8:45, you have the Israeli Air Force attack Egyptian air bases. The first wave, 183 aircraft, the second wave, 164 aircraft. And by 11 o'clock, 319 out of 340 Egyptian warplanes were destroyed, and 100 of Egypt's 350 pilots were killed. The Israelis had planned everything to minutest detail in terms of the weaknesses, in terms of Egyptian radar coverage, limitations that they could not detect planes which were flying at 500 meters or below. And at 8:45 was the time, of course, that the dawn patrols had landed. The other patrols had not taken off. The officers, the commanding officers of the bases were either having breakfast or between their homes and the bases. So it was masterfully planned. So in terms of, it was a flawlessly executed operation. The pilots had around 7 minutes over the bases. They could make 3 to 4 strafing runs, and then fly back. So in terms of the outcome, of course, Egypt was knocked out within 1-2 days. The Sinai was taken. The Jordanians, who had foolishly entered the defense pact on May 30th with Egypt, started shelling Jerusalem and all that. That, of course, gave Israel the pretext excuse to attack, take Jerusalem and Samaria and Judea, with the West Bank. And of course, the day after Israel also accepted the UN ceasefire resolution, they attacked and took the Golan Heights. And in fact, the intention initially was also to try to go towards Damascus, but the Soviets stepped in, warned the Americans that if the Israelis do that, they will intervene in the war. So Johnson put pressure on Israel, and of course the Israelis stopped June 10th, and the war ended there. So I'm sorry, I apologize, I went over time, very un-Swiss of me, and I'll leave it at that, and if you have any questions, I'd be happy. This presentation was partially based on a conference we had back with Dr. Votalem, organized at Webster. A publication that he edited also called Political and Military Incidents, about this, about the Stark incident, about Ustica, about the KL, the Korean Airlines that were shot down. So I brought 10 copies. I'll put copies on the desk, on the table outside for those of you who are interested. So thank you very much, and apologies for the English and